removing the import rule would have some advantages and obviously some clear disadvantages. And if you remember back in history, the biggest example of the import rule not existing and people taking advantage of it was LMQ. And they had Rush, Impact, and Zhao Zhao and Vasily, right? And they just dominated North America. Now, currently, you can only have 2 imports per team, and then, of course, Academy only allows 1 so that you produce more North American talent. Now, it's very clear that Korea and, well, now currently China have the best players in the entire world. And we've long cited the problems with North America, and as far as why we don't have North American talent is because of solo queue problems like the ping or just not enough players in the player base, and then also culture as well too, right? It seems as though Koreans just have this hardcore mentality that they will do this thing and only this thing, and they will be the best possible. And then, of course, there's also the infrastructure took longer for us to build as well, too, as far as coaches and team houses, things like that. So we have been lacking behind the Koreans specifically just because they've had a longer infrastructure with like Brood War setting up things. So they already had coaches and stuff like that. And then, of course, you have the whole actual Korean culture of listening to your elders, which obviously the coaches will be the elders, so you listen to them, and then you also listen to the veterans. So there's just this whole dynamic, and all these reasons why I guess there's not much North American talent, right? And I think some of this has credence and whatnot, but of course this is all largely just excuses, right? And I'm not here to argue in whether this is true or not true, but to compare this to another game, say if we didn't have the import rule, right? Say if you could just have a full team of Koreans, you could have a full team of Chinese like LMQ back in the day. Well, this is what Overwatch League is, right? Everyone contrasts League of Legends and Overwatch League constantly, and we have seen that within Overwatch League, the majority of teams have at least 1 Korean. I think back in March or April or something, someone on Reddit had said every Overwatch League team has at least 1 Korean. And the entire Overwatch League had 44% of players as Korean, as just one nation, right? That's straight bananas. And if you think about the reasons as to why people want NALCS, like North American talent, or why we just want to build up our own talent and build up our own region, is first, nationalism just has super deep roots in the majority of people. Now, when you think of nationalism, it's like, okay, well, I can relate to this person more because they're North American. They come from where I come from, and they've been through similar circumstances that I've been through, rather than, say, if you were to talk to someone from, like, Sweden. Well, Swedish people have a different culture, right? Maybe you say something that normally wouldn't offend a North American, but when you say it to a Swedish person, suddenly they get offended because you just don't know their customs, right? So it's this whole range of knowing what to expect from a person because of their nationality. And so they've just grown up in the same culture. And then, of course, you have the language barrier, right? Language barrier is one of the biggest and most obvious things in which if you had all these imports, you would have a huge language barrier. And with language barriers, I think there are 2 things in which it's the hardest things to overcome within a language. One is idioms. Idioms are like, oh, the sky is falling, or it's raining cats and dogs, or it'll be a cold day in hell before I do that. These are all idioms in which you say something that is not a literal meaning, but it means something else. And some of them aren't as obvious, right? Like raining cats and dogs. Like, it's not literally raining cats and dogs and there's blood everywhere on the streets and all these dogs have broken legs. I guess the cats would land fine, right? Cats always land on their feet. I don't know. But it doesn't necessarily mean that. It means it's raining heavy. It's a downpour of water. So idioms are very hard to understand, and it's one of the last things in which you learn within a language is idioms. And we use those far more than you would actually realize. And then, of course, there is sarcasm. Sarcasm is very hard to understand if you don't know the context and the overall background of the actual conversation and just the actual topic of what this person is talking about. And it also, sarcasm is very different based on tones, especially within English. English is more of a raised indentation of tone at the very end of, oh yeah, I would really do that. It's like, that's obviously a portion of sarcasm. So those two things are very difficult to understand when it comes to language. And when you have a language barrier, well, suddenly it limits a person's personality because they can't use those as effectively. So you won't often find someone who is a foreigner that has a personality that uses a lot of idioms, or a personality that uses a lot of sarcasm. It's very difficult to do that until you start to become accustomed to it and you become a master at that language. And so that limits personality. And then you have just, we as humans like to be tribal. We like to put things within specific categories because we don't have enough time to understand the nuances of specific things, right? And this is where your stereotypes, this is where your racism comes from, is people put things within groups because they don't want to learn about that specific person or thing. It's like, one instance would be McDonald's is unhealthy, right? I don't want to eat at McDonald's because all of it's unhealthy. Well, it's like, no, it's not actually true, right? There are some things on the McDonald's menu that is healthy, but as a general rule of thumb, I'm just going to avoid it because there's a lot of unhealthy things. I've heard a lot of unhealthy things about McDonald's, so I'm just going to avoid it, right? You put it in a category, and that's what tribalism actually is. You put it in a category. And with Overwatch League, that's what they're doing. They're putting things into a category, a smaller category. And as you go further and further down into tribalism, and you break things down into smaller groups, it does get more dangerous, and there is a point in which you break down tribalism so hard to where you become racist, or you become believing about stereotypes full-heartedly. But with Overwatch League, they take advantage of tribalism by attaching players to cities, right? The Los Angeles Valiant. It's like, oh, I'm from Los Angeles, I guess I'll choose the Valiant, or I'll choose the Gladiators, or maybe I'll choose Excelsior because I'm from New York. So those are different aspects of how they're taking advantage of tribalism and overcoming the context of entire nationalism, right? Because they have a lot of Korean players within their league. Now, how to connect with players in the LCS primarily is through content, right? So we have a lot of content. You know, I do interviews, and so I'm allowing the fans, or I'm, I guess, perpetuating a bridge for the fans to connect with the players, right? This is in, obviously it's in Overwatch League 2, but this is one of the main driving factors of LCS itself in learning these personalities. And then, of course, there is streams, players streaming, and so you can ask them questions or whatever on their stream, and they'll interact with you. It's more difficult to do if you have this language barrier, right? And then another major big proponent within the LCS is victory. It's, I want to be a supporter of a very good team. That's why TSM has one of the largest fan bases, is because they've won so many times. So LCS fans, they attach victory as a large portion of their fandom. And you contrast that to Overwatch League. Actually, the Shanghai Dragons, who went 0-40, have one of the biggest fan bases, and it's because of the nationalism aspect of, well, okay, well, I'm from China, so then I'm going to root for the Chinese team, the Shanghai Dragons, right? So it's attaching something else besides victory or besides content. And Then, of course, I also heard that the Overwatch League allows translators to be used and on hand for third-party media. So Overwatch League actually provides this for media, which is actually pretty dope. Maybe, I don't know, you guys should do that, LCS, so that we can start doing more Korean interviews. Because if you notice, there aren't actually a lot of interviews with Korean players because they don't speak that well of English. So it normally goes to Invent Global. They end up doing a lot of the Korean interviews, and then they translate it because, well, they are the translator. They speak both English and Korean. So they don't necessarily need a translator. And the only way that you could do an interview with a Korean player is if they speak English, or if the team themselves provide a translator, and sometimes they don't do that. Well, Overwatch League, that's how they've overcome this barrier, right? And so if LoL had no import rules, we would probably see the highest level of play possible, right? Because we would just import mass amounts of Koreans and Chinese, and they would fill up every team. But the import rule exists because that would be the case, and also it would end up as a bidding war. It would be whoever has the most amount of money would then buy the best players, and suddenly that would drive up salaries super hardcore, because what are the two things that LCS relies on? Victory and content, right? Well, if you can't do the content aspect anymore, or at least you're not relying on it as much, well, then I'm going for the victory aspect. So I'm going to import a ton of Koreans or a ton of Chinese, and I'm just going to win and get my fandom that way. And so you would have this bidding war of, okay, well, I want to buy Faker, and then I'm going to buy Impact, and then I'm going to buy Peanut, and I'm just going to create the sickest team possible. And so it would just end up to where the richest team, probably Team Liquid, would end up winning. And so you can't have that. So you'd either have to have a import rule, which what we have now, or you would have to have a salary cap to regulate this, because otherwise things would get out of control. Now, to contrast this to another game entirely is CounterStrike. Now, CounterStrike is also very regional, and this is probably more likely due to back in the day, it was very regional in the 1.6 days, and that's primarily because, well, there were just smaller LAN tournaments, and the scene was smaller as well too. So you would get a couple buddies from your country, or even your city, even smaller, and then you would create a team and you would go to small LAN events within your entire country or your town or wherever. And so you would go to these LAN events and you would get money and you would get experience, and then you would hear about these international competitions, say like this CPL, or you would see ESWC, right? And there weren't too many big international tournaments anyways, so you would decide to go to one or the other or whatever, and you all would save up your money to go to this. But there wasn't a whole lot of intermingling of players from different nationalities and different countries in order to actually make these diverse teams. And now in Counter-Strike Go, we're seeing that seep into it, right? But it still isn't fully there. We still had Immortals who had that entire Brazilian team, right? And they all just spoke the same language. So you still see that it exists very strongly within Counter-Strike, but I think that's because it's been perpetuated by the 1.6 days more so than anything. I think they could literally just change it up and have multi-language comms and everything like that, which of course, as we all know, it breaks down synergy and things like that, and I think that's of important value within the Counter-Strike community more than anything. So overall, I think the import rule exists because they want to put a cap on exactly how many players that one specific team can buy, which then decreases or increases the salary cap for all these very high skilled players. And then of course you don't have the fandom of the Overwatch League where it ties it to cities or regions, right? So you don't have that to go off of. You don't have the tribalism to go off of. And then you have CounterStrike, which was in relation back to the olden days of 1.6, and they just kind of carried it over and carried the scene over. And that's just a very long history within that game to where things have just worked that way for so long. So there are different reasons as to why region locking or roster importation rules exist within League of Legends. There are different circumstances for Overwatch League or for Counter-Strike that don't necessarily apply to League of Legends itself. So while I don't necessarily like the import rule because I would like to see the highest level of play, these are the nuances as to why it actually exists and why it works for other games, but it doesn't necessarily work for League of Legends if you not have these region locks.